The cut and thrust sword is the most well-known weapon of the medieval age. Although depicted in media as being both a stalwart icon and a brutal weapon of death, the finer points of sword combat are often lost on the big screen. Swords are incredibly well-rounded and diverse weapons, performing well in a variety of situations.
This sword is a reproduction, a modern reproduction of an original sword in the Higgins Armory collection. The original sword was made sometime around 1300. It was dug up out of the ground, and so it's in excavated condition. This reproduction gives you an idea of what that sword would have looked like in its heyday. It's a typical cut and thrust sword of the Middle Ages, and all swords are going to have, roughly speaking, some of the same kinds of parts. You've got, to begin with, the blade and the grip. The blade itself can be further subdivided. It may have one edge, it may have both a front edge and a rear edge. It will typically have a point. You can also describe it as having a foible and a fort. The foible is the part of the blade toward the tip. The fort is the part of the blade toward your hand. There's a crossbar on this style of sword. That crossbar helps to protect the hand from your opponent's blade sliding down and injuring you. It can also be used to leverage the opponent's sword to gain some kind of control. It also often has some kind of a decorative dimension to it as well, as you can see with this example. The grip itself is typically going to be made of wood, wrapped with cord, leather perhaps on the outside, and then at the far end, the pommel. This sort of rounded piece right here serves as a counterweight to the blade, and it also has potential use in combat. At short distance, you can use this for bashing at your opponent. In fact, the modern word to pummel somebody, to beat on them, comes from the pommel of a sword, because that's exactly what you can do with that part of the weapon.
Although swords come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, the most iconic version of the weapon is the longsword. Precise, sturdy, and flexible, the longsword is the stable knightly weapon.
The longsword is the all-around knightly weapon of the late Middle Ages. It's not as, doesn't have the same reach as a spear, it's not as quick as a dagger, it doesn't have the same power as a warhammer, but it can imitate all of these different weapons depending on how you use it. The longsword's great advantage is its versatility. What distinguishes the longsword from the single-handed sword or arming sword is that the arming sword is designed solely for single-handed use. This can be used single-handedly. It's balanced to be quite functional in one hand, but it has that extra length both in the blade and the grip that allows it to be used two-handed as well. But aside from that detail, pretty much all of the specifics of how a longsword is used are more or less the same as the use of any cut and thrust style of sword. Your dominant hand is on at the crossbar, your secondary hand is on the pommel, and the grip is fairly fluid. In fact, you never want to hold your sword in a death grip. You'll firm it up at the moment of impact so it doesn't get knocked out of your hands, but you will have a fairly loose, fluid grip, particularly on the pommel, that allows the sword to be moved around quite freely, and then kind of firm it up at the time when you actually need that strength and security in the grip. The longsword, like any cut and thrust sword, has the same kinds of parts. The tip for thrusting. Most of the attacks are delivered with the foible. This is the quickest part of the weapon, delivers the most power at the point of attack. It also obviously has the most reach. The fort of the weapon is the part of the blade nearest to your hand. It has much more leverage and can be used for slicing actions against the opponent, but is by and large more used for defensive purposes and for controlling the opponent's weapon. The crossguard protects the sword hand, as well as offering potential for controlling the opponent's blade again. And then the long grip of the longsword to accommodate two hands, and the leverage between the two is one of the most important features of the longsword. It allows you to deliver fairly quick and powerful cuts, even without having to move your arms particularly, just from the action of the two hands working in concert with each other. And the pommel, as with any other sword, has its own potential uses. At close quarters, this can be a very effective part of the weapon for bashing your opponent. The longsword can also be used, particularly in armored combat, with the hands on the blade. Turned around, it can deliver a very powerful blow with the crossbar or with the pommel, essentially imitating the power of a warhammer. And in armored combat, the sword is actually held with a secondary hand on the blade. This gives you the pinpoint control over where the thrusts go. You can't really use the edge of the weapon against an armored opponent, and so it's all about the point in armored combat, and this spear-like position gives you the kind of point control that you need.
It is important to note that in this section, all techniques and drills apply to both one-handed and two-handed cut and thrust swords. When practicing swordplay, commonly used positions of readiness known as guards provide both offense and defense in varying situations. The plow guard is primarily used to defend against and deliver lower cuts and thrusts, while the ox guard is used to attack and defend from above. By winding between these two guards, as well as changing sides, a swordsman can place himself in a variety of favorable positions for battle. There are 4 main cuts available to the swordsman, and each traces a different line of attack. The scalp cut traces the scalp line. The wrath cut traces the right and left diagonals from top to bottom. The middle cut traces the middle line. And the low cut traces the diagonal lines from bottom to top. Each cut has guards that it passes through. The scalp has the high, long point, and full guards. The wrath cut has the wrath, a slightly different version of the long point, and change guards. The middle cut has the left middle, a horizontal long point, and the right middle. Finally, the low cut has the side, hanging point, and unicorn guard. There are 5 cuts described as master cuts that any swordsman must learn if they are to truly understand swordplay. The first 2, the scalp and wrath cuts, are 2 of the basic cuts covered earlier. Accompanying them are 3 cuts that emphasize protecting oneself while threatening an opponent. The thwart cut is used to simultaneously protect one's head while striking your opponents by helicoptering the blade above you to the opposite side. Maintaining a horizontal blade and placing your thumb on the crossguard is vital. The squinting cut also provides an attack towards an opponent's head, but does so by sweeping the blade down in a moulinet before bringing it back up over your opponent. This allows a swordsman to protect their side from attack. The crooked cut is the final master cut, and also the most defensive. Sweeping the blade in a vertical helicoptering motion protects a swordsman from any possible attack, while simultaneously getting offline, giving them an advantage over their opponent. Footwork is the base for most forms of combat, and swordplay is no different. Swordsmen have a variety of steps to utilize. These steps are the passing step, the gather step, the sliding step, the triangle step, and the back step. Each step has a different purpose, and knowing the right situations for each is of critical importance. The passing step is a good technique if a combatant wishes to change his lead foot and change the distance between himself and his opponent. The passing step is also useful for striking while moving. The gather and sliding steps are useful for advancing or retreating, but do so in a much shorter step and maintain the same forward foot. In contrast, the triangle step is a stationary step used to change sides without advancing or retreating. Note how both swordsmen maintain the distance between them while switching sides. The back step also strives to achieve stationary defense, but does so by moving the swordsman offline in order to both avoid the attack as well as position him favorably for a counterattack. There are a number of drills and exercises a swordsman can perform either individually or with a partner to hone his skills. One of the simplest, the molinet, is also one of the most useful. The molinet helps build the rotating motion needed for smooth, swift, and powerful movements of the blade. Performed overhead, as well as side to side, the molinet covers all aspects of movement with the sword. The mirroring drill is an easy routine for swordsmen of all skill levels to learn and requires 2 people to perform. The drill works by designating one swordsman to be the leader who will guide the drill by choosing which steps and guards to use. The follower must then attempt to maintain distance and guard positions with the leader. The drill can be further enhanced by adding cuts to the rotation. The straight cuts drill is as straightforward as it sounds. Performed individually, a swordsman goes through each of the 4 straight cuts: scalp, wrath, middle, and low, on each side. They can be performed stationary or while moving. The 2 and 4 quarters drills teach swordsmen about different targets to aim for on an opponent. More advanced swordsmen can perform this individually, but it is easiest to perform with a partner. Both drills involve one swordsman advancing to his opponent and striking one of the 4 corners of his opponent. In the 2 quarters drill, the swordsman attacks another corner on the opposite side, then retreats. In the 4 quarters drill, the swordsman attacks all 4 quarters before retreating. These drills strengthen a combatant's striking technique, as well as stressing the importance of striking while retreating, to protect oneself from reprisal. In addition to drills, sequences can be performed to reinforce all of the previous skills learned. In this example, one swordsman attacks with a middle cut, while the other defends with a hanging point guard. Afterwards, the defender goes on the offensive, delivering a middle cut to his opponent, and the sequence cycles from there. Once both swordsmen understand the basics, finishing moves can be added to the sequence. After parrying, a swordsman can control his opponent's weapon with either his weapon or his offhand. When controlling with the hand, the swordsman can perform a pommel strike. Meanwhile, controlling with the hilt of the sword opens up the possibilities for a disarm or a throw. More complex sequences which recreate a specific scenario can also be performed. This particular scenario reinforces the cores of swordplay along with emphasizing proper use of the thwart cut and potential counters to it.